Today's symposium seeks to highlight the role of the Indian Navy as an instrument of nation building, as already flagged by the Chief of Naval Staff. We set course for our first session by traversing back to our maritime past. Titled Legacy and Loss of Freedom at Sea, this session will be moderated by Vice Admiral MP Muralidharan, AVSM and Bar, NM, retired. The Admiral is a distinguished naval veteran and retired as a Chief of Personnel in the Indian Navy. He was a former member of the Armed Forces Tribunal at its regional bench at Kochi, an appointment equivalent to a sitting judge of the High Court. During his tenure of around 4 years, he authored nearly 500 judgments with some landmark decisions. He is also a former Director General of Indian Coast Guard and a navigator by specialization. Apart from that, he has been known to pursue numerous scholastic avenues during his career in conjunction with his primary responsibilities. The first speaker in this session, Dr. Radhika Seshan, is a renowned scholar of Indian history and has concentrated on economic history, especially maritime and urban history. She retired as professor and head of Department of History at Savitribai Phule Pune University. Also now a visiting faculty at Symbiosis School of Liberal Arts. In this session, she will talk about the millennial legacy of maritime influence across the Indian Ocean. The second speaker will be Dr. Kurush Dalal, a distinguished archaeologist and the Director School of Archaeology, India Studies Center, Mumbai. He is also the co-director of the Salsit Explorations Project, a massive urban archaeology project documenting archaeology of Mumbai since 2015. This work has been going on, thus extending his interest from the medieval into the colonial period. In this session, he will be speaking about the malaise of sea blindness. May I now invite Vice Admiral MP Muralidharan, AVSM and Bar, NM retired, to moderate the first session. Admiral, you have the stage, rather the screen.
Thank you, Commodore Johnson. Honorable Raksha Rajya Mantri Shri Ajay Bhatt, Chief of the Naval Staff Admiral Karambir Singh, CNC Western Naval Command Admiral Hari Kumar, my fellow members of the naval fraternity, both serving and veterans, members of the academia, friends of Maritime History Society, and all those tuned in to celebrate and commemorate Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav, and my fellow panelists. Let me at the outset thank Headquarters Western Naval Command and the Maritime History Society for giving me the privilege to participate in this webinar and to chair the first session, which is on legacy and loss of freedom at sea. We have two eminent scholars examining our rich maritime heritage and the subsequent loss of maritime consciousness. When we look at India's maritime legacy, the archaeological evidence found in Mohenjo-daro, which is 3,000 to 2,500 years before the Christian era, indicates that even at the time of the Indus Valley civilization, Indians had regular seafaring activities. The Rig Veda mentions sea voyages and as a prayer seeking blessings for safe passage across the seas, which says, "Do thou convey us in a ship across the sea for our welfare." It also emerges that shipping was a systematic and regulated activity in ancient India. Manusmriti, the ancient legal text, has provided for maritime trade rules, and Kautilya's Arthashastra, compiled nearly 2 millennia ago, indicates the post of a chief controller of ports and shipping. It covers the aspects of port dues and customs duties. It further has a control of shipping and ferries, who was responsible for a variety of maritime activities, including welfare of sea traders and seamen, and ensuring seaworthiness of ships and tackling piracy. Arthashastra clearly states that pirate ships and enemy boats violating territorial limits should be destroyed. The Mauryan Empire also had a board of shipping to look after shipping related activities. All this would clearly indicate that ancient India was very active in maritime arena. Historian Radha Kumud Mukherjee, who had analyzed India's maritime activities and linkages from ancient times, in his book, The Indian Shipping, A History of Seaborne Trade and Maritime Activity Through the Centuries, which was published in 1912, says, and I quote, "We have ample evidence to show that for full 30 centuries, India stood out as the very heart of the whole world, maintained her position as one of the foremost maritime countries. She had colonies in Pegu, which is in modern day Myanmar, Cambodia, Java, Sumatra, Borneo, and even in countries of further east as far as Japan. She had trading settlements in southern China, in the Malayan Peninsula, in Arabia, and in all the chief cities of Persia, and all over the east coast of Africa. She cultivated trade relations not only with countries of Asia, but also had the whole of the then known world, including countries under the Roman Empire, and both the East and West had become a theater of Indian commercial activity and gave scope to a naval energy and throbbing international life." Unquote. Well, nearly 3 decades after Mukherjee and closer to our independence, Sardar K.M. Panikkar, a diplomat, historian, strategic thinker, and statesman, propounded similar views when he said that millenniums before Columbus sailed the Atlantic and Magellan crossed the Pacific, the Indian Ocean had become an active thoroughfare of commercial and cultural traffic. In a study entitled India and the Indian Ocean, he had further observed that the close connection between the early civilizations of Nineveh and Babylon and the west coast of India is borne out by undisputable evidence, and this was possible only through navigation of the Arabian Sea. Panikkar expanded on this subject later in a study entitled Asia and Western Dominance, where he said, Indian ships had from the beginning of history sailed across the Arabian Sea, set up to Red Sea ports, and maintained intimate cultural and commercial connections with Egypt, Israel, and other countries of Near East. Long before Hippolus disclosed the secret of monsoon to the Romans, Indian navigators had made use of these winds and sailed to Bab el-Mandeb. To the east, Indian mariners had gone as far as Borneo and had flourishing Indian colonies which existed for over 1,200 years in Malaya, the islands of Indonesia, in Cambodia, and Champa, which is in modern-day Vietnam, and other areas of the coast. Indian ships from the west coast in Ceylon made regular journeys to South China coast. So a long tradition of maritime life was very much part of peninsular India. Sadly, despite such a rich legacy, there was a clear decline in maritime activities in India sometime towards the end of the 13th century, and maritime outlook started waning. By early 16th century, command of the sea was lost by Indian rulers. Again, Panikkar had analyzed this and said that the Mughals, with their Central Asian tradition, had no recognition of the importance of the sea. The result was that during 200 years of Mughal greatness, not only was the sea entirely under alien control, but foundation was being laid by others for a more complete subjection of India. The importance of the sea came to be recognized by Indian rulers only when it was too late. This resulted in the European powers, starting with the Portuguese, taking control of the oceanic waters around us, and the Indian Ocean virtually became a British lake by the end of the 18th century. Now, Panikkar, quoting Khairuddin Barbarossa's famous saying, "He who rules the sea will shortly rule on land also," went on to opine that the history of no country illustrates this principle better than that of India. There has been invasion and conquest of India from the land side on many previous occasions, but such invasions and conquests have either led to transient political changes or to the foundation of new dynasties, which in a very short time became national or Indian. In fact, it may truly be said that India never lost her independence till she lost command of the sea in the first decade of the 16th century. Now, the significance of maritime activities in Indian context was equally well appreciated by our first Prime Minister, Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, who, while sailing on board Indian naval ship Mysore in 1958, observed, and I quote, "And from this ship, I looked at India and thought of the country and its geographical situation. On three sides of it, there is sea, and on the fourth, high mountains. In a sense, our country may be said to be in the very lap of the oceans. In these circumstances, I pondered over our close links with the sea and how the sea has brought us together. From time immemorial, people of India had very intimate connections with the sea. They had trade with other countries and had also built ships. Later, the country became weak. Now that we are free, we have once again realized the importance of the sea. We cannot afford to be weak at sea." Unquote. Now, against this backdrop, let me invite Professor Radhika Seshan to speak on our maritime heritage. Over to you, Professor.
Thank the Maritime History Society for thinking of me for this webinar on the notion of maritime heritage. Let me go straight into my talk, and let me start off with the idea of a maritime heritage. When we talk of heritage, we invariably think of it as monuments. So a monumental heritage becomes a key component of the entire context of the notion of the heritage. There is an advance that in recent times we've started talking of natural heritage as well. But we don't think of the maritime world as part of that heritage. So I'll begin with the question of what is maritime heritage? The idea of maritime heritage is something which I think needs to be much more clearly understood. At one level, it encompasses the involvement with the maritime world. And that maritime world has been part of our history for a very long time, even though it has not been regarded as being part of that history, but it has been considered to be part of that history for a very long time. So the first element of maritime heritage is the involvement with the maritime world. The second is the longevity of such involvement. As I just said, our involvement with the maritime world has been a very long one. The two are connected. We need, therefore, to establish both the nature of certain points of connection, the establishment of the centrality of maybe an event at a particular point in time, and then the heritage of this continued engagement with and this continued involvement with. So what we are also looking at is an understanding of the historical parameters of continuity and change, for we are looking at heritage as something which encompasses an involvement, the longevity, and which has then changed over time. What I will focus on in this talk is two major, let us say, epochs or events in India's connection with the maritime world: the Cholas and the Konalis. The Cholas and Konalis are separated by close to 6 centuries, because the Cholas were in the 11th century, their peak period, and the Konalis were in the 16th up to the beginning of the 17th century. So 11th to 16th, there is a time gap. They're also in different spaces, because the Cholas were particularly concerned with the Bay of Bengal world and the Tamil Nadu coast, whereas the Konalis were looking at the Kerala coast and the Arabian Sea littoral. So they were looking at a different area. But in both, one can see connections in the approach to the maritime world, in the notions of access to that maritime world, as well as the changes in what it is that they saw as being of prime importance in their engagement with this maritime world. Connection also exists in that while I am talking of Bay of Bengal and Arabian Sea, we need to remember that this was all part of the greater Indian Ocean world. And this Indian Ocean world was something which was a united world, but sometimes compartmentalized and often separated into its different components in the ways in which one engaged with it. So they are part of that Indian Ocean world, the great Indian Ocean world, which stretches to include the African coast, India, the peninsula of India, the Bay of Bengal, and the Southeast Asian, and to some extent extends beyond Southeast Asia into and up to the South China Seas. What I will focus on specifically is one aspect of the Chola engagement. And I'm saying very specifically one aspect of the Chola engagement because the Cholas, Rajendra Chola and Rajaraja Chola, between them established connections all along the Bay of Bengal coast. It is right up to, Odisha on the east coast, and they do go into the area of the Konkan coast as well. So in some ways, they are establishing, through the land, they are establishing a connection with both the coasts of India as well. The word that comes to be used is, it used to be used earlier also with people with the Chalukya rule application, but it comes to be reused is Tri Samudradipati, the Lord of the three oceans, of the three Samudras. What I will focus on is a specific event, the expedition to Suvarnadvipa, or as it was known in the inscriptions, Kadaram. Kadaram is an area in Southeast Asia. It lies, actually, if one is looking at the map, it lies in what is today Kedah. So there is an expedition which is launched from India to Suvarnadvipa, which is the center of a maritime empire called Srivijaya. Any number of views about why they went to Suvarnadvipa. The great historian K.N. Shastri said that it was the politics of plunder. Others have linked it to the trading guilds that exist, so to the Ainut River and to other guilds of the south that were very important. Still others have argued that it is necessary to place it in the context of the emergence of three great empires in this period, the Fatimids, the Song dynasty, and the Cholas. So it is part of the global history of connected worlds. All of these are important. And maybe it is a combination of all of this, but at the moment I'm not getting into that. What I would like to emphasize is that this expedition is relevant in two specific areas which are important from the point of view of maritime heritage. First is knowledge of navigation. The second is the knowledge of and the ability to build large expeditions, large ships. Both of these are crucial elements to any maritime connection. Navigation here. Now, this expedition set out from the port of Nagapattinam. Nagapattinam itself has a very long history and yet another connected history. For instance, the king of the king of Thailand, I think, Malaysia, gives money for the maintenance of a Buddhist monastery at Nagapattinam, and this is added to by the Chola king, so that he also gives more money. So there is a Buddhist heritage here, there is a maritime heritage here, there is a trade link here. All of these are connections, and these are embedded in the knowledge of navigation and the skills that existed and the methods of navigation across the Bay of Bengal. We all know about the 10-degree channel and the ways in which one could get across to the coast of Burma from the Coromandel coast if one used the 10-degree channel. But from Nagapattinam, one does not use the 10-degree channel. One goes further, slightly further south to go into the Malacca Straits. This knowledge is part of a long established negotiation and engagement with the Bay of Bengal. To this has to be added that if they are traveling in this way, then they are obviously traveling with ships that are built along the coast. A problem is that we don't know what ships were built here. We do know that they were built. We don't know the exact shipyards. We assume that Nagapattinam was the place where the ships were being built, but we cannot confirm this. I must emphasize that this was not a naval expedition in the modern sense of the word, that the ships were not armed, but they were used as transport, and so they were used to take the soldiers from the coast of the Coromandel to Suvarnadvipa, Srivijaya, and then were used in the London battles. But here is the first concrete evidence that we have of a large-scale, state-sponsored and state-directed expedition which goes across the sea and conquers the land and brings the booty back to India. And Rajaraja's inscription goes into tremendous detail. As I've said, the Cholas drew upon this earlier well-established connections with the seas and Southeast Asia. And these, as I've said, were also connected to the Bay of Bengal. The earlier movements, and later movements as well, were all connected to trade. But there is no compartmentalization of knowledge. The knowledge that the traders have of the methods of dealing with the sea are at the service of the state. So the knowledge of the merchants was available to the rulers. The expedition resulted, as Rajendra Shrila's inscription says, and as I put here, so immense booty. And he actually goes into saying that it is with this booty that I have rebuilt my great temple of Brihadishvara. To be remembered that the inscriptions identifies 12 other port cities in the Malay Peninsula, Sumatra, Nicobar Islands, all of which were not just touched by the expedition, but which were then part of the conquest that was claimed here. Another very interesting thing is that after the defeat of the Srivijaya king, it was said that an annual tribute of elephants had to be sent to the Chola emperor. Here's yet another dimension of shipbuilding techniques, that they had the knowledge of how to build ships large enough and stable enough to transport elephants across the Bay of Bengal. And as we all know, the Bay of Bengal is not exactly the most calm of seas. Let me jump a few centuries and now move to the Kunalis. Kunali Marakar is the term that is given to the naval chief of the Zamarin of Kozhikode or Calicut. In later times, they have been described as Kunali 1, 2, 3, and 4. There were 4 major admirals. They were the leaders of the Zamarin's navy. They were, throughout the period between 1520 and 1600, which is the time when the Portuguese power was being established in Malabar and in Goa, they were key figures in the Zamarin's engagement with and operations against the Portuguese. Kunali Marakar and his brother Ahmad Marakar were probably merchants, probably from the Kannur area, maybe elsewhere, but they established themselves in Calicut in the 1520s. And their knowledge of Arabian Sea navigation, as well as their connections with the world across the Arabian Sea and in the Persian Gulf and in Arabia, came to be at the service of the Calicut Zamarin. From the 1520s, as the Portuguese started tightening their hold on the coast, the Kunalis began and the Zamarin began to lead the movement of subverting the Portuguese systems. On land, there was probably some kind of guerrilla warfare. At sea, there were what the Portuguese constantly complained of as corsair activities, piratical activities. All the stories that we get about the Malabar pirates pick up strength at this point. And the Portuguese records make it very clear that Zamarin and his naval chief were dangerous people. The Kunali attacks fit in much more with our modern conceptions of naval warfare, because the Portuguese ships were armed in the way in which we have learned since colonialism, during and since colonialism. But the Portuguese lacked one of the advantages that the Kunalis had. The Kunalis were able to defend the coast. So even if the Portuguese controlled the sea, the deep sea, they could not control the coast. Kanhoji Angre, in the 18th century, he prevents the English, Dutch, and the Portuguese ships from landing unless they pay him a tribute. So the defense of the coast by the sea, the defense of the coastline from the sea and along the coast is something that becomes part of the idea of naval warfare on the Arabian Sea coastline in this period from the Kunalis onwards. The additional factor, of course, is that the Kunalis and Kanhoji later got the support of the local communities along the coast, something which the Portuguese lacked and which the English took a very long time to build up later. Unfortunately, the problems that we have with India's history, that the sovereign and the naval chief fell out, and the Zamarin joined hands with the Portuguese to destroy the Kunani power. So the last of the Marakar naval chiefs was killed in 1600. And with that, this form of naval resistance, of naval uh, access, was totally ended in the Malabar region. The entire structure of the engagement with the sea was something that was of importance in a whole lot of ways. Let me go back to the point I made at the beginning. This is part of our maritime heritage. This is part of our history, but it is a part of history which ends up being very locally determined and locally understood. It is not part of general understanding of India as a maritime nation. This is something which I think needs to be emphasized, because unless we understand ourselves as a maritime nation, we cannot think of ourselves as having a maritime heritage. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sheshan. I think Professor Sheshan very aptly, with the case studies of the Cholas and the Kunyalis, brought out how clearly we exerted naval power as was known at that time, but yet because of internal differences, we could not push it further forward. And she also, I think, made it very clear that most of this got localized. And as a nation, we did not appreciate our maritime power or maritime outlook. And it is very much important for a nation to know its maritime heritage. Only then can it understand the values of maritime issues. I would now request Dr. Kurush Dalal to tell us about the malaise of sea blindness. Over to you, Doctor.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for having me here. Vice Admiral Muralidharan, it is an absolute pleasure to be introduced by you. Dr. Seshan, it is an absolute honor to follow in your wake. And I'm sure it's going to be really difficult after the amazing presentation that you have made. I will be speaking in a more general view on the blindness of the sea as far as the powers on land are concerned. So a very, very big thank you before I start off to the Maritime History Society and to Commodore Oracle for having me here and the rest of the team who are running the entire show behind the scenes. What you have to understand about India and the sea is that India has this enormous coastline, and it is impossible that India did not engage with the sea. The various different fishing communities that line the entire coast of India are without doubt people who are incredibly comfortable with the sea, especially in the form of a whitewater navy, if not a blue water navy, right from the earliest times. In 213 BC, Ramesses II died in Egypt. We know this date without any doubt. The nostrils of his mummy are round, beautiful corns from the west coast of India. There is no way they went there but across the sea. Who and was Bever across the sea in 13th century BC from is one of the great of the period. Added to this, we do know that mythic peoples of southern India and of other parts of India, especially of Kerala and Andhra Pradesh and Tamil Nadu, were very much in contact with the various different peoples of the Indo-Roman period. We know right from the 2nd century BC that the Ptolemies were sending ships down the Red Sea to trade with India. The difference here is that the traders and the various shipping communities and the various shipping worlds that existed at that time were not directly controlled by any polity, but were essentially either fishing craft or trading craft that were dealing with various different coastal trades, either local, hyper-local, or in some cases international. The Indo-Roman period is a bit of a misnomer because India as an empire did not trade with Rome as an empire. But Roman merchants coming through various intermediaries, especially Arab mediaries, probably Nabateans, many of them from Egypt, some Aksumites without doubt, and some Arabs, were all coming pell-mell to the Indian coast for trade, and various different coastal goods were being traded by these people. They would purchase them and take them back. We know that the Indians refused in many cases to buy the goods from the West, considering them inferior, and would only trade in exchange for hard specie. In fact, the word spices comes from the specific taxes levied on the various different spices, not, of course, on pepper, at the port of Alexandria before they were shipped out to the rest of the Mediterranean. So it tells us that there was an intricate, complex network of shipping, and that there was definitely a very, very solid maritime world that existed at that time. But was there a navy? What we do know of the navy is that most definitely the Western Kshatrapas in the period between the 1st and the 4th centuries AD had ships that would divert ships to their harbors instead of going to the Satavahana harbors, and vice versa. We know that Bharuch was in the hands of the Kshatrapas, Supara was in the hands of the Satavahanas, and they vied for trade, and ships would be diverted there by obviously naval craft because they were officially government craft. But was there a navy that went out to sea and fought? No, there wasn't. This kind of a concept of fighting on the high seas was not really something that existed in India during that period, and it did not exist in India in the Mughal period either. I regularly get people who tell me the Mughals were short-sighted. They did not understand the importance of a navy, and this was the dark ages for the coast. It wasn't. It was an incredibly lively period for the coast as far as the local coastal traders were concerned. The Mughals came from a landlocked place, and they had mainly a landlocked empire, and it was truly only in the periods of Jahangir, to an extent Shah Jahan, and then to a large extent Aurangzeb's time, that they were in contact with the sea. Their number one port was Surat, and the reason for this port being Surat was essentially to send people on Hajj. Everything else was secondary, but do understand that every single European power and every single man of war that wanted to come with various different ambassadors to go to the Mughal court all had to come and dock at Surat. And this is where their factories were, and this is where the earliest colonial trade really took place from. So yes, they were not maybe fully fledged navies, but they were definitely craft that were owned, equipped, and manned by the state. We know from the island of Socotra, interestingly, of very, very interesting crafts leaving from Goga and Hathab and coming to Socotra during the reign of Aurangzeb, especially ships owned by Aurangzeb himself. So there is an enormous amount of history that we need to relook at. We need to re-understand, and we know that the Siddhis ultimately who established themselves at Janjira were also a seagoing peoples and formed the navies of the Arabs, formed the navies of the Mughals, and this was also a very, very important part of the Mughal defense of this region. It is the Portuguese that truly brought armed conflict to this region, and yes, the Mughals and even the Marathas, sadly, were not really a match for the Portuguese. The Portuguese were a blue water navy. The Dutch followed briefly, luckily for us. The French concentrated mainly on the east coast, and they had their own colonies there. The Dutch then moved into Southeast Asia and Sri Lanka, and then lost Sri Lanka to the British. And the British, who came last, came perhaps best equipped and settled down and created the naval forces that we truly understand as a navy today. We underestimate the importance of a merchant navy, and sometimes we overestimate the importance of a proper navy as far as an armed force is concerned. Whilst not taking away anything from the Indian Navy, I would really, really like to say that the Indian Navy is something we require for today's day and age, thanks to the Europeans. We didn't really need very many armed navies before, especially in the upper half of Western India or in the upper half of Eastern India. And the only true navies, as we've heard Dr. Seshan speak about just before me, were the great navies of the Kunjali Marakars, and were the navies of the Cholas, and definitely the navies of the Pallavas before them, that went all the way to Southeast Asia and established the Indic Indium in these regions. So yes, it was in some ways a dark age as far as an armed naval force united under a polity was concerned. But then again, I think we have done justice to it in the here and the now with the amazing force that is the Indian Navy. Thank you very much for having me here. Over to you, Vice Admiral.
Thank you, Dr. Dalal. I think you have brought us a totally different perspective from what we normally gather. You also brought it very clearly that the maritime activities of those days were focused on trading, and the concept of the navy that we know today, except as brought out earlier also through the Cholas or little bit Pallavas and then the Kunjali Marikkars period, did not exist. But we need a navy today. Well, you'll all agree with me that the well-researched observations of our panelists make it amply evident that India needs a maritime outlook and the importance of sea power for a nation like India, and how the lack of it resulted in our subjugation. The naval operations during World War II in the Indian and Pacific Oceans, and more significantly, the entry of Japanese Navy into Indian waters, brought into focus the importance of control of the seas for the security of India. Fortunately for us, the emergence of strategic thinkers like Sardar K.M. Panikkar, who highlighted the need for a maritime perspective to further India's national interests, and the appreciation of the importance of the sea power for a nation like India by Prime Minister Nehru, resulted in revival of a maritime outlook in modern India. This vision led to the thrust for development of our ports and associated infrastructure all along the coast, revival of our mercantile marine and shipbuilding activities. More importantly, the growth of Indian Navy from a virtually coastal force at the time of independence into a major maritime force with an air arm and an aircraft carrier by 1961, and development into a major maritime force is reflective of the revival of maritime outlook in India. Over the years, India was also able to develop a very balanced navy capable of operating well away from our waters, and a coast guard to safeguard our exclusive economic zone. Even as independent India was still developing her economic, industrial, and scientific capabilities, Indian Navy took the necessary steps for indigenous construction of warships, or what we would today call as Atmanirbharta, for construction of major warships in the 60s. We have come a long way since then, and are today into construction of major warships and submarines, including aircraft carriers and nuclear submarines. I'm sure all of you have read in the newspapers over the past few days about how the first indigenous carrier had undergone trials. In keeping with the 21st century concept of Indo-Pacific, India's maritime forces are today operating deep into the furthest reaches of both these oceans, and also carry out regular exercises with maritime forces of other nations. While the 1962 and 65 wars possibly shifted some of our focus into a continental outlook or towards our neighborhood, there is clearly a growing conviction that India's future greatness is linked to the oceans. This is very evident from the views enunciated by our Prime Minister, Shri Narendra Modi, at the Shangri-La Dialogue in June 2018, when he said, and I quote, "The Indian Ocean has shaped much of India's history. It now holds the key to our future. It is also the lifeline of global commerce. The Indo-Pacific is a natural region. It is also home to a vast array of global opportunities and challenges. I'm increasingly convinced with each passing day that destinies of those of us who live in the region are interlinked." He went on to say that we should all have equal access as a right under international law to the use of common spaces on the sea and in the air. And he emphasized that our sea lanes will be pathways to prosperity and corridors of peace. I would like to conclude by saying that it is apparent that 21st century India is once again looking towards oceans for her security and economic prosperity. Her increasing interactions with nations across the entire Indo-Pacific and beyond are a pointer in this regard. But I must add that we should recall lessons from history, and we should not lose our maritime focus. Let me once again thank our eminent panelists for their very erudite insights and the Maritime History Society for organizing this webinar. Jai Hind, Shano Varun. Over to you.
Thank you, Admiral. What a fascinating fair for us to witness as researchers and as a Maritime History Society with the panel. And in a very succinct manner, thank you, Admiral Muralidharan, for looking forward and looking back as you highlighted the oceans and the current view of the apex leadership and the important need to look back at history. So with that, we are closing the first session and we will soon tack to session 2 in about a minute. And don't go anywhere, stay engaged because a rich audio and cinematic treat lies ahead. We'll be back in a minute.